I am very happy to announce that we have Christopher Ruocchio, who is the author of the Sun Eater series. We've been doing a few of the book reviews, and we're gonna get through all of them. So if you have not read the books, I recommend that you wait to listen to this till later, because I am not going to in any way say that there's not going to be any spoilers in this episode. Please, if you're not interested in hearing spoilers, wait till later, because then this will be a really, really interesting thing to listen to, a very great interview. But there may be some stuff that we talk about, especially in book 4, because that's my favorite book and it will spoil a lot of things in the entire series. So Christopher, welcome to FoMO. We're excited to have you. We're just absolute fans of the books. We've been reading them, loving them, and excited to hear that you've got a bit of an announcement for us. Can you share it? Is that fine?
Oh yeah, sure. So I was saying just before we started recording, you guys picked a good day. I turned in book 7 today. I reviewed the copy edit, sent it all back. So I'll still have to do the proofread, which I kind of sort of glazed through. At this point, I've seen the book too much, but that's not really any more work. It's just reading and making sure there wasn't a last minute typo. You know, it's not writing. So the book is done. The series is done.
Shadows Upon Time. Still the same title. No change in the title at last.
Yeah, minute. Shadows Upon Time. Yeah. November 18th. If folks, keep an eye out, the e-article will be on NetGalley pretty soon. So if you're a book blogger, reviewer catching this, it should be available even sooner than that. So.
Oh man, I am so excited for this end of this series. And one of the things I wanted to start off with was, you're a prolific writer. I mean, there are some writers like Patrick Rothfuss, we've been waiting for the book forever. You have just been cranking out books like with a passion, with a fury. What's the secret? Do you have something that allows you to just stay on track? Brandon Sanderson sometimes talks about this, that he has a rhythm. He writes, a lot. He's got a certain time that he writes. Do you have a way that you stay on track, or is it just that you had this entire story, the muse caught you, you had to get it out? What was it that allowed you to just blast these books out with no interruptions?
Well, I don't know about no interruptions. I have 2 small children, but it slowed down the last 2 books a little bit. But there really isn't a secret, right? I find a lot of writers, even ones who've been around longer than me, who are still trying to find the secret, like it's alchemy, and there isn't one, right? It's you need to figure out what works best for you, right, in terms of routine and things like that. Like I have to work in the mornings. If I don't get up and start writing, I can't start later. If I don't get 1,000 words done before like 8 a.m., like it just won't happen. Something will come up, right? And like, God forbid, I try to start writing at like 3 p.m. I could spend the next 4 hours trying to write 100 words. It's just not possible. So you have to figure out who you are and how you function, right? But like the secret, right, is that this is my job now, and I wanted it to be my job then. This is the only thing I've always wanted to do, and I have like always taken it seriously, and that helps. Especially I started writing or trying to write when I was a little kid, right? I must have been 2nd grade. I was like, I don't know how to write a book, but like I know I want to, so I would just sort of fuss at it as best as an 8-year-old could do. And then I was 9 and I was much better, and then 10 was better, and I just kept working at it consistently. And this is, I think, the secret to anything, right? And so there isn't.
Well, Lucas, right? That's kind of like getting better at volleyball, right? I mean, you just keep playing volleyball and you get better at volleyball. Writing, anything you do, you just keep working at it and you get better at it.
I mean, although writing and starting at 2nd grade is quite a devotion. What at 2nd grade what spurred you on thinking I want to write when you were that young?
I just really love books. My parents, neither of my parents are great readers, but they have this sort of boomer generational sense that like reading is an objective good. And so they really encouraged me to do that, discourage television, which I mean is good, right? But just they would let me read, and there was never the sense that like I couldn't read something, either for difficulty level or frankly for content, which maybe that's a little bit of a gray area. So I was always trying to read like bigger and older and more challenging books, and I just loved reading so much. I was 4 when Harry Potter came out, and that was like slightly before. There was a time when it was out and no one cared about it. Really, like it was a thing, but it wasn't any bigger than any other series at the time, right? And I remember being bullied for liking it when I was really little, first grade maybe. I think that was around the time the third one came out, and then the people who bullied me then went on to go to the theme park, and I haven't even seen all the movies at this point. I jumped to ship to Tolkien around the time those films started coming out because they were everywhere, and it looked cooler to me, right? Because I'm just a kid, right? And not only is it cooler, it's objectively better in so many ways.
So when did you get to Dune, and when did you read
Audio
Hyperion?
CDs of Lord of the Rings, the old Rob Inglis recordings, the big red recorded books box set, and I just listened to those until I like destroyed the CDs. Just for years, I must have listened to Lord of the Rings 200 times in my life, and they're the only audiobooks I owned because you used to have to buy the CDs and they were expensive. And so I just never really branched out for years. I didn't branch out, and so I just sort of like steeped in Tolkien for years as a kid, and I just really wanted to do that. And then this was alongside reading. I read a lot of like Star Wars books because I loved the original films in particular, but I loved the prequels as well when they came out because I was the right age. And so there were sort of these two tracks, and those converged in Arthur C. Clarke's blurb on the cover of Dune. And I was like, oh crap, like I should read this. And that was
okay,
really,
but that was my
really
question though, Christopher. So when did you read Dune, and when did you read Hyperion? Because when I first approached Sun Eater, it caught me for a second because I was like, this is familiar. It may be too familiar, but then I really was like, okay, wait, I love this. So, but it had an echo. So I got to imagine you've read Dune, and you must have read Hyperion.
I did, yeah. Dune was very early. That would have been, I think, 7th grade. I remember I had Heretics of Dune in my backpack my first day of high school, which was probably too soon to be reading that one. But Hyperion would have been later. That would have been college, I want to say freshman or sophomore year. I came to that one quite late. And I came to Gene Wolfe even later. That would have been actually after I'd written the first draft of book 1. But these were sort of milestone, sort of paradigm shifting reads for me in a lot of ways. I like to joke that it is from Hyperion that I learned that I could reference these things. And so I wanted to, in the same way that Simmons in that book kind of dialogues intensely with sort of the books you read in your high school curriculum, because he was a high school teacher, right? I wanted to dialogue with the science fiction books that I had grown up loving. And it never occurred to me that this was going to be a problem for some people. And maybe I didn't handle it as deftly as I could have, especially earlier on. But my sense had always been that I wanted to start somewhere familiar so that I could then do something different and sort of juxtapose my ideas, right? Because we all, I think, read this way, to some extent.
I actually kind of love that because I read this book, Save the Cat, and they're like, I want the same thing, but different. And I think that's kind of, if you're approaching Sun Eater for the first time, you're like, you're going to find something that's familiar, and then it starts to go off into its own space. And that is where I think it kind of really caught me. I really started to get really passionate about this series, about book 3 and then book 4. Kingdom's Death. I mean, when you wrote that book, I mean, that book is a masterpiece. It is crazy. Thanks. All I can say is Hadrian, he is born to suffer in this life. It's kind of where I think some of what you've done with the series is patterned on Christ. He suffered a lot, and man, Hadrian suffers. And so when you get to book 4, you're just like, you bleed with this man for everything that happens to him. It is brutal. You were not nice to him at all.
No. Well, that's sort of the central element of existence right now. Maybe we don't all end up in POW camps. I certainly haven't, but I think suffering is inescapable. It's not just me thinking that, right? That's just true. And
that's in Hyperion too. I mean, you've got the pain tree, you've got the people that are stapled to this tree for like eons or whatever is happening, and it's this it's growth through suffering in some ways. But sorry, not to interrupt.
No, that's okay. I think that's like a central sort of part of experience, right? And so I find that while it's very common for other writers, at least in our genre, to to look at things that are dark and hideous. They don't. There's an attitude towards them that I think sort of feels a little bit insincere. Is maybe the right word. I don't know. Awful things will happen, but in a sort of a psychologically safe way. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to get at, but it's sort of like I watched Twin Peaks earlier this year for the first time, and I watched these interviews with David Lynch because he's such a delightful character to listen to himself, right? And he's talking about how one of the things that made him want to make the show was this idea that these murders had been sort of packaged up for entertainment, and that rubbed him the wrong way, and he wanted you to sort of experience the local tragedy of this girl's death, right, at sort of scale, right, and to sit with it. And I think that is not just a more sort of mature attitude towards darkness, but a truer one, because if someone does die in your town that you knew and you cared about, like it's gonna actually not be over at the end of the hour, right? With a few words from our sponsor, and so I've always sort of it's one of those things like I hadn't thought about it in those terms, right, until I saw the interview and I was like, oh yeah, that's how I feel about it, right? And so I wanted to pay special attention to suffering actually as an experience and not just as a part of the world building, as a piece of furniture. And so I'm glad to hear that you love the book so much. That's awesome.
When the tale is being told, Hadrian is recounting this tale from the future. He's writing his memoirs. I was a little nervous at this because it's like, unless you have the whole scope of this story and you know exactly where it's going to go and where it's going to end. And he does talk about that. He's like, you know me, I destroyed the planet and this is my legacy and you're reading it and you can quit any time if you don't want to hear the rest of this tale. Did you feel at all like, some of that stuff that you said in the first book, now I've got to go back and actually, I got to weave that in somehow. Like what was I thinking years ago when I first wrote this? Because, if you might not see the entire story from the very beginning. And so then do you have to go back and figure out a way to write some of those things in, or were all of the touch points in your mind when you started? Did you have this master outline that you were able to write from?
No, I really outlined the series a book at a time. And that's largely because there were contract renegotiation issues. It was never clear how long the series is going to be. Book 4 and 5 were originally one novel, and they got split because of paper costs following 2020 and supply chain disruptions. And then we had some hiccups back and forth with publishers on books 6 and 7. And so the full scope and scale of everything didn't really... it was always a negotiation, right, with reality. And so I had sort of a cloud of things I wanted to get to, right? And it's a question of how and when exactly. And it's possible, right, when you think that way, to end up putting some of those ideas between books, right? And then having them impact, say, how a book begins. In terms of, I've always thought about Hadrian as a different person in each novel because there's just so much time between each one, with the exception of 4 and 5. That's just overnight. But but that was also a weird project because of the split, And so it's possible some of those ideas didn't actually get written about. They got sort of shunted between books and they impacted the character of the book that followed, right, or something like that. And
sometimes I thought maybe, there was a technique of an imperfect narrator. It's like he's trying to recall this stuff. He's like, Valka has perfect recall. I don't really remember this that well. I'm going to do my best. You get a little license because you are having your memoirs, and it's like, well, it's how I remember it. But maybe I'll make mistakes. Who knows?
Yeah, and that's something I've tried to play with too with the supplemental works, the novellas, the short stories. I've tried to challenge not Hadrian's reliability, but his perceptions. I think we have this tendency when we see first-person narrators to think they're just all deceitful bastards. And I certainly encounter this attitude in my readers from time to time. And I don't see Hadrian that way. I just see him as a person whose perceptions are not always 100%. He doesn't understand the people he's talking to the way they might understand themselves, or he might just not know things. Often asking those questions is kind of a post hoc thing, because for the purposes of writing Hadrian's life, it doesn't really matter if he doesn't understand something, unless it's directly impacting him in some way, that misperception. which is not all the time, right? Sometimes it's like, oh, I have an idea. Like, what if this character actually felt this way, right? And was, sort of dealing with that, right? Secretly, and Hadrian has no idea, right? And then that becomes the story. It's like, oh, this person that you sort of, didn't think about, right? Hadrian was having this whole other internal life. Because life is like that too, right? It's like actually, that person on the other side of the table, right, has their whole story that you might know this much of, right? And like, sure, he acted like a jerk, but why, right? And that's one of the useful things about the novel, or at least the sort of prose narrative format, right, depending on the length, is that you get to engage in that most terrible modern vice, right, of psychologizing people and figuring out what makes them tick, or which if it's a fictional person, you can just assert, which is nice, right? You can't be wrong as a writer about how someone feels because you're making them up. In real life, it's a more dangerous game, but for my purposes, it's perfectly fine.
And you were talking earlier about some of the science fiction books that you had read as a child.
Yeah.
What about the historical aspect? I love history. I've had to read up on Roman history. I'm amazed at how many facets of Roman life that you have worked into a space to a space opera or whatever we want to call it. How long has that thread of history run in your life?
More or less the whole time. My dad, as a kid, my dad was really into the Civil War and into the space race, and it was really the space race that I think had sort of cast a bigger shadow. I remember watching the whole Ken Burns documentary with him when I was in maybe 5th, 6th grade, something like that, right? And that sort of impacted me, right, pretty greatly, just because it's it's so well assembled. It's, all the primary sources and stuff. But I, the space race kind of pulled double duty in that it sort of oriented me skyward, right, and it sort of led into science fiction in some way. And but I also went to Catholic school, kindergarten through 8th grade, and we had a pretty sort of robust religious historical education at my school, and so that's obviously looking at the the turn of the epoch, right, the first couple centuries BC, first couple centuries AD, early church history, all of that stuff, and so that is Rome, right, and sort of the associated polities, and I just always found the world and time and circumstances so interesting, and not for any particular reason. I think there's a sort of romance to the aesthetics of the classical world, right? That I think a lot of us feel, right? It's one of the reasons I think that the whole "why do you think about the Roman Empire" meme, because it's cool. It looks cool. The buildings look cool. They look better than the boxes we live in now. The statues are cool. The armor is cool, right? And I think as a kid, that's very persuasive, right? Like without having to go any deeper. And then as you go deeper, right, you start to realize that, like, wait, and this is like largely like I've mostly stopped reading other science fiction and fantasy because it's hard to do that and work. It's just you kind of get burned out on fiction. But the other thing too is that like it's real, right? You can go to these places and you can you're impacted by them, you're shaped by them, right? There's the sort of meme, I don't know if it's true actually now that I say this, but about the width of railroad tracks being determined by the standard sort of Roman chariot, right? I can't remember if that ended up not being true or not, but like it's a good example of the principle, right? The European road network largely still follows the Roman one, right? Our institutions certainly do. You only have to look at the facade of the Supreme Court building, right, to see this sort of, in this case, Greek temple, right, and certainly these ideas were sort of very present in the minds of our country's founders. But it's not just our country, right? Basically every country in the Western world claims to be, heir to Rome in some capacity. The American eagle is the Roman one. Or at least it's like great grandson, and that connectedness, right, speaks to the whole story of, at least in this case, Western civilization, but it's part of the bigger story of us, period, right? History of the world as a whole. And it is the coolest planet in the solar system. It's probably the coolest planet in the universe because it's ours, actually. And like, man, that's really cool. And there just isn't anything, I think, more interesting than maybe this is egocentric, right? I am a human saying this, but like, I don't think there's anything more interesting in this universe than us. I think you could probably make a strong objective claim for that, right? Just like consciousness is so bizarre, and we're like the only species that has it the way that we understand it, right?
That comes into play in the books too, right? Because we have these three cultures. We've got the extra Solarians, they're kind of body modification, and they're kind of finding the path of technology. And then you have just humanity, like canonical humanity. It's, Roman style living life, but kept away from technology. So it's almost like we have, this Roman Empire that is re-envisioned, because the serfs, the plebeians, are not allowed to use high technology. They're not allowed to use much of anything. And then we have the Cielcin, and then we have a little bit of, aliens that are in the mix. But we do have these kind of three races that are all competing. And I definitely feel like when we're in Demon and White, where we're mostly just in Empire, it's cool. It feels cool. It feels like, oh, they're in this like, kind of high society technology mixed with the Romans. It's a kind of a cool ethos.
Yeah, and there's a lot of exactly the thing I'm talking about, these little things, right, that like tie back into not just antiquity, but to our time, right? And this is something I think a lot of science fiction writers don't do. There's this sort of Whig history belief, right, in sort of linear progress. And it's like, why do we need all this stuff, right? Like all the stuff that's around today, like we're going to throw it away. It's like, we didn't do that though. Like, have you been to a museum? Like human beings don't think that way. We keep stuff and again, we're influenced in ways that we can't even begin to sort of fully wrap our heads around by the stuff that happened before us, which is why history is such an imminent science, right? Like it's way more important that people understand history than that they understand chemistry, actually. Unless you're mixing bath chemicals, be careful. Watch out for the chlorine gas. But your life is far more likely to be affected in ways, I think, by like history and sort of political circumstances, and those kind of blur into each other, than it is by like how much math you know.
So one of the, as you're talking about the blend of history, you invoke fasces, the fasces, the bound bundle of sticks. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which I love, because there's all this talk of fascism today. People, I think 1 to 2 to 3 Americans understand that they see fasces all the time on our currency, on seals of the United States, with all of our Roman heraldry. When you come across a concept like that, you also are one of very few people who knows what a decimation is.
Sure.
And I bill myself sometimes as the ombudsman of decimation and devastation on Wikipedia, because everybody uses decimation incorrectly, and I couldn't believe that you spell it out for people in such a way.
I feel your pain, right? I'm in the same position. It's just like, it's not what it means.
When you stumble across these, I wonder what your thought is about how fascism is bandied about today. But when you run across some of these vestigial notions that still exist in the tapestry of our lives today, do you feel like you're redressing them or just reintroducing them? How do you spin that into your stories?
Well, so with regard to sort of the philosophy of fascism, right? Like it is a modernism, right? Like it is this weird sort of post-French Revolutionary LARP, right? These people who sort of they want to sort of turn the clock back, right, and get back to what the sort of not almost parodic sense of sort of the Roman Empire, not the real thing. I'm frequently frustrated by people using the term because they usually, it's a very particular ideology from a very particular time and place. It's also essentially defunct in its canonical sense, right? Like none of the people who call themselves fascists today would really be recognizable, right? Except for certain like sort of ultra fringe types to someone like Mussolini. I think be like, I'm not having dinner with you. Get out of here. It's hard to articulate this because I feel like I should probably also say like it's also like silly. Like it's not a viable philosophy. It doesn't work. Every civilization that's tried it failed in the same way that every civilization that's tried communism failed. They aren't viable. It's a bad idea. And so one of the things I like to do though is get these symbols that are like kind of confusing or these sort of cultural ideas and kind of go back to their actual context and reuse them more correctly in the setting, using the sort of fasces in sort of its more sort of Roman legal context, sort of, I don't taking it back is sort of a cheap phrase, right? But it like forces the reader to think that maybe I don't fully understand this thing that I think I understand, right? Why is it being used here? It's like not even like a hugely important sort of thing in the text, right? But like I thought this was a thing that belongs over here. Hang on, right? And this is one of the things that's nice about stories. I don't particularly love The Witch, but I really love Robert Eggers because he will pull these little details out in a setting, right, and force people to sort of look at this period like in the Northman, they'll look at the Vikings a little bit differently, right? Because you are forced to look at them more, less like the sort of caricature that you see often in film or in fiction generally, that horrific History Channel show.
I wanted to ask you about the Romans or about the Vikings for a second, because when I'm reading the book, the Cielcin, to me, my first thought was this has got to be what the Vikings were like to the English and to the people that they were around. Here's these marauding, tall, bearded, coming out of the north, raping, pillaging, stealing, just like worshiping weird gods. I mean, this is the alien as much as to borrow a term from Orson Scott Card, they're the far else. I mean, you can't reason with them at all. They're just like not really acting like human beings. And that was my first thought of what the Cielcin were like. And then as I read further into it, then I get this sense that you've also drawn some thoughts of wolves or dogs or whatever in the way that they bare their teeth and they show their neck, and that they've got this dominance play. It's like, am I on the right track with what you were thinking when you were crafting this very evil and this is like singular type of enemy that's in the book?
Yeah, obviously this is tricky, right? Because I also like kind of love the Vikings, right? So like I don't want to say like, oh sure, right? Like they're based on Vikings, like ew, right? But because we're talking about people, right? And the whole point in making an alien theoretically is that they're not people, right? And they shouldn't really be an analog for people. This is one of the reasons I don't like Star Trek. The aliens are almost never good enough.
These aliens are terrible and they're awful, and you did a good job of making them very alien. They are nothing like humanity. And the more, again, that's why when you get to Kingdoms of Death, you're like, you get to really see the Cielcin and what their culture is like, and you're like, oh man, there is no reasoning with these. These are not humans. And Hadrian was wrong at the beginning. You cannot make pact with them.
Yeah, of course, the danger in making aliens, right, or making orcs. I missed that last bit. There's a little lag, and I started talking over you. You say again?
Don't sweat it. Go ahead. I got my point across that they were very alien, and that the culture from Kingdoms of Death. But go ahead.
Yeah. So the trouble in making aliens, right, is that you're a human being trying to imagine something that isn't human, right? So like any of the horrible things they do is something I thought up, right? Or like had inspired by something, right? Whether that's some part of the animal kingdom or something that we did. I thought about the Assyrians a lot in sort of putting the Cielcin together. You go read like the like Ashurbanipal's sort of war monuments, and he's like very proud of how many ears he cut off and stacked in a pile, right? And like it's very hard to imagine a person feeling that way, right? Because actually humanity has come a pretty long way in 3,000 4,000 years, or in 200 even, depending on what we're talking about. Of course that's not like that's not one of those sort of linear time statements, right? We're just in a very different place. We could go back, probably. We're still running on the same hardware, actually, largely, and so you never know. But it is still hard to imagine stuff like that, and so it's tricky when you make an alien. Like you're still a person making an alien, so it's like still probably really a person, but you gotta try, right? And so that's difficult, and I guess that's sort of my only point, is that there's sort of this big problem in trying to imagine the sort of absolute other, right, in the sense of not a person, because of your own hardware and software, and so certainly like there's some of the Vikings in there, right? The Assyrians as well. There's some of the Aztec. I think about thought about the Imperial Japanese as well to an extent, because I didn't want them to be completely unreasonable either, right? Like you can have a conversation with them, and there are sort of rules and things. I didn't want to just make a monster. I wanted to make a monster that's a person, right? That's not a human person, but
I almost wonder if part of what you got when you started to have that was that there were these interactions that the Cielcin were having with humanity, because you say in, I think, parts of the book where you're like, well, the Cielcin king, he's taking on some aspects, he's trying to mimic the emperor. Is that where they're getting some of their humanity, is from this cross-cultural, they're sort of rubbing off on each other?
Maybe, right? And that's like an interesting question, right, to think about in the text. I don't want to declare one way or another, right? But this is also like something you would see if you look at like the history of steppe nomads coming in off the Pontic-Caspian steppe into Western Europe, right? They would there's a joke. It's like they would convert to Christianity or Islam depending on their preference for alcohol or cannabis, right? Or hashish at least, but in doing this, right, like one of the things the Byzantines would do, the Eastern Romans, to convert tribes, is they would just bring them to Constantinople and impress them. They would bring them to divine liturgy, and they would just show them around the city, and like, here are all of our cool walls. Here's our aqueducts. Here are our cool pictures. Wasn't the mass amazing? You should convert, by the way. And they were they were gunning for the culture victory if they were playing Civilization, but this was very persuasive, right? And so you would have these these sort of like Bulgars or Alans or whatever, right? Their kings would convert, and then they would start calling themselves Tsar or something, right? And they would start wearing the costumes and adopting the manners. With Cielcin too, like the big touchstone for the main one, Syriani, is Attila, right? And I mean, Attila almost married a Roman princess, right? And
well, I mean, Syriani kind of does that in Kings of Death. He takes Hadrian around, he shows him everything. I feel like he kind of did that, like that. That feels like something that he was doing as he brought Hadrian to their world, to their home, and started to show him around the gardens and stuff. So it feels like maybe something like that kind of happened in Kingdom of Death.
Yeah, well, both Syriani and Hadrian are kind of mirror images in a way of each other, right? They're both xenophiles who like don't get to be, actually, because of circumstance. But there's a lot that interests them in the other culture, right, in the other species, and but for nature and circumstance, maybe things could have been different, right, in a different universe with slightly different rules. One where instead of the cosmological constant being a little bit more, it was the whatever the the coefficient on the two species being unreconcilable to some degree. If that were just a little bit different, things could have been different. And so yeah, so they're both sort of doing the same thing. Hadrian, early on, especially in his life, is a lot more of like a sort of Cielcin culture adopter, right? He wants to, he speaks the language. He wanted to learn the language. No one made him. It was something he pushed his teacher to teach him. Syriani taught itself. Probably had some Scalias slaves who educated it. But it wanted to do that so that it could understand humanity better and fight it better. And then like along the way is like, oh, like these ideas are interesting. Like, how do I feel about that? Compared to my alien philosophy, right? And it likes ideas, and this is important, I think, in writing a villain anyway, right? Like the villain needs to challenge the protagonist philosophically more than in any other way. I think, even if like the main character is never going to accept the villain's argument at all, right? The argument the villain needs to make is ideological, right? Because really, what you want to do, right? I've said before, like the sort of meme is that the villain is the hero, from his own point of view, and it's like that's not putting it strongly enough, right? You need to think of the villain as a hero, right? Period, right? Like don't qualify it in your own head as the artist, right? Like, like the villain needs to make their case, right? They need to like be inspired, because the thing that makes villains really inspiring is their virtues, actually, right? And intelligence is a virtue, right? Charisma is a virtue. If the argument, right, is incoherent, the philosophical challenge is useless, it's not at least interesting, then it's not really a challenging villain at all, right? You think about sort of the sillier superhero villains, like I want to destroy the world because, right? It's like for no particular reason. It's not, it's just what I do. I was the Power Rangers Monster of the Week as my job, right? It's not good enough. And so I really needed Syriani to challenge Hadrian essentially, right? As opposed to just, for a big CGI slug fight. So, no.
I had a Shakespeare teacher, and she harped constantly as to the brilliance of Shakespeare was in part of the roundness of his villains in some of the ways that you described. I read a little bit of Marlowe. I was surprised. I wondered whenever I saw Marlowe as the name of a character, if you were drawing from Kit Marlowe at all. And then when I saw that sort of that his I don't know, I hate to say sidekick, but for whatever, his sidekick was named Will. Why Marlowe is the main character and Will is a side character?
I don't have a deeply intellectual, satisfying reason for this, unfortunately. So I sort of worked backwards towards the name from a lot of the symbolism anyway. So maybe the intelligent part of this answer is I have this whole thing with the sort of devil, gargoyle, angel symbolism across the series, right? And Hadrian was always going to be identified with those things, and so I wanted his family symbol to be this devil in sort of like a Jolly Roger kind of pirate flag kind of way, right? And so I was like, what would be sort of appropriate there, right? And I thought of Faust kind of automatically. And there is sort of a Faustian nature to younger Hadrian, I think, in particular, because he wants to sort of get ultimate knowledge in a sense, right? He wants to understand the aliens, and he pays a price for it. It's sort of a poisoned dream. So there's like some very loose Faustian sort of resonance there. And in doing that, I was like, oh, Marlowe, right? It was that or Goethe, and I thought Goethe probably wouldn't work. So I picked Marlowe for the name, and that had the dumb sort of double benefit of his first name being my first name, right? And so in a sense, right, the great houses of the empire all tend to claim descent from important historic and mythological personages in the same way that like Charles III is descended from Odin, right? In some way. which could be true. I don't know. Right, but in the case of Christopher Marlowe, is certainly not true because he had no children and was probably not inclined to, and so it's like clearly a false sort of ancestry. On the other hand, like I made them up and my name is Christopher, so like I thought that was funny to me. So and then as for Will being Will, I work backwards from that too. So this is actually, I had not noticed this, which is funny until you pointed it out. I wanted to have the same name as the Emperor, who I knew was a William. And so there's sort of they is sort of a phenotypic resemblance between those characters, but I wanted the sort of person who's at the very bottom of society to have the same name as the Emperor, because of course, like kids would be named after the Emperor, right? Like that happens all the time. But there's maybe draw your own conclusions about what that might mean. But that was sort of the thinking with the names, and so it wasn't precisely a Marlowe Shakespeare thing, but
Okay.
but I'll take it. That's a good one.
I mean, I thought it was brilliant. What about Hadrian? Why? What do you love about Hadrian, the actual emperor?
Well, so why the name first is because it doesn't actually, we don't know what it means precisely. It means like guy from Adria, and we don't know what the etymology of the place name is. So I picked kind of meaningless name, but it's also, in picking names for book characters, you have to serve a lot of masters, and like it needs to be recognizable. It needs to be simple, but it needs to be distinct. And like, man, it's like a really tough sort of target to hit. But I think that worked. I also picked it slightly as a nod to Mervyn Peake's main character. His name is Titus. I picked a different emperor, and I just sort of thought that would be, in my own head, that was satisfying for absolutely no reason. I just like that sort of helped give me a target. That being said, the emperor himself is super fascinating, right? He presides over the empire at its greatest extent. And begins its contraction, which was not obvious at the time, right? So sure, like we'll give up, Mesopotamia, whatever, right? We'll probably get it back. Oops. The empire probably couldn't have held it anyway, but like, I'm not saying it's wrong to do it, but there is a certain turning of the wheel associated with his reign, right? But he is also, he's one of the five good emperors, right? And I tend to think mostly they're overrated, Trajan notwithstanding. But he was an interesting character, right? He was a Hellenizer, right? He was very interested in Greek culture. Brought the beards in, which as sort of a spiritual Roman, I have mixed feelings about. But he also like tried very hard to portray himself as sort of a simple man, right? He dressed as a common soldier. He would like eat with the legionaries, and would try to like understand them. He toured the empire, right, and actually tried to understand it, which is, usually the emperors, if they were touring the empire prior to this, it was for conquest reasons. It wasn't just to sort of do the rounds, and so that was sort of an interesting thing. And yeah, so these are all features of his biography I find appealing.
I like that you brought up that he reigned over Rome at the extent of its growth, because as I read the books, I'm wondering, is this, I should say, I also look at America today and consider it in many ways an extenuation of so many Roman concepts of that empire. I am of the empire riding home. But we're also at this point in a possibility of a diminishment in the empire, if not the American empire. Do you see any resonance between the story that you're crafting and what's going on in the world now?
Oh, I try not to think about it. Honestly, because I think I think one of the greatest dangers for a dramatist is to become a polemicist. Drama is better than polemic because you can say more than one argument, and you can do more. there's a Le Guinn quote. I'm not going to get right. It's something like art is about conveying an experience without using words, and a writer uses words. And so what you're trying to do is give people more than an idea. You want to give them a set of feelings and a set of sensations, right? You want to give them an experience. And if all you're trying to convey is vote this way, vote that way, then, boo, like that sucks. And like most people can smell that, even if you've hidden it very convincingly. And I think it's, so like this is like a super pretentious maybe thing to say, but like the thing that's I think ultimately so appealing to me about writing, and this would be true if I was a filmmaker or if I was a video game developer or whatever, right? Is this, right? You get to create something, right? And this idea in Tolkien, right, of the author as sub-creator, right, is participating in sort of this this like act of God, right, in a way, and hopefully that's in a sort of posture of humility, and it's not like I'm not getting a big head or anything, but like I feel something very significant about making stuff, right? And I think I'd feel the same way if it was a chair, right? My dad does carpentry, and in creating it well, that I think is satisfies a sort of spiritual impulse. And so I want to do more than just sort of bash people over the head and sort of direct things. And so I try actually not to think about present day circumstances at all. I completely missed, for example, the dust up between Iran and Israel last month. I was on a trip and I came home and I was like, wait, what happened? We almost what? Just as a sort of demonstration of how out of touch I try to be with this stuff, because I largely think that there's not anything any of us can do about current events anyway. Like you and I are not operating the levers of power in any meaningful way. And it's maybe inappropriate for us to worry about it too much. I don't think it's good. That being said, I take your point, right? Like there is a cycle of sort of rise and fall, growth and decline in civilization period. And it does, it is very popular to sort of resonate contemporary America with sort of 4th century Western Rome, right? I don't know that that's the most, I don't know that that's right. I suspect sometimes that we're actually more in like late Republican Rome, in which case there's a lot more growth ahead of us. I don't know what the time scales are going to look like, or whether or not elevated technology speeds things up, or if it slows things down. It might actually slow things down. Like it might take longer for our sort of supergiant imperial phase to burn and flare out. But it's like, of course, like our country won't live forever. No country does. And so it's not inappropriate for us to have these anxieties or think about these things. But for my part, I mostly am just trying to create a imagined future that feels like a reasonable extension of our time and place, while at the same time, being entertaining. Like I want it to be cool in that way I was talking about. Like I want the Roman stuff to be cool because I want people to get excited about, Roman space armor and, cool swords and things, right? And to sort of scratch that more basal itch.
So I had a question about the Christ-like nature of Hadrian. So he's sort of a messiah. He's the herald of this being that's far in the future that will be birthed at some future point. He dies and is resurrected, and in some ways he has these Christ-like experiences where he has to show his apostles, look here, it's really me. Put your finger in my hand and I'll show you where I was pierced by the the spike that was driven through my hand when I was crucified. Did you have a sense that in some ways you wanted to bring in aspects of Christ's life and his journey into the story of Hadrian, or am I just reading it as somebody who is steeped in Christian theology?
No. I mean, of course it's deliberate, right? I'm a Catholic, and I make no attempts to hide that or excuses for it. And and so, you know, that story, is the story, right, that has sort of animated civilization for the last 2,000 years, not just in the West, like increasingly, you know, in other places. And it has the benefit of being true, which helps. But it is also, it's so deeply etched into our cultural memory, right? I was talking to, who was I talking to? I think it might have been at one of these panels of this convention I was at last month, where like I'm working on this next thing, and without really getting into that, right? I have this problem where the culture that the world is based on, right, is not one whose sort of names and vocabulary are as immediately imminent in sort of the average American reader's mind as names like Hadrian, right? And so I have this problem where names mean things, even if like we don't know, right? You know what names mean, right? I was explaining to my 2-year-old what her name means, and you know my name, you know, she's 2, right? So like I'm trying to simplify the vocabulary, you know, it's like means God helper, right? Which is like close. You know, to bear is maybe a little bit hard. And you know, and the names mean things. And even if you don't know what John means, like the name John has will trigger a series of vague associations in even the least literate person, right? That like makes the name familiar and comfortable. And this is true of sort of stories too, right? And even for people who have like not been to church in 40 years, right? These moments mean something to them, even if they aren't religious, right? Even if they disdain religion. And people are, I think this is largely the reason things like The Sandman are so successful, right? Because it touches on all these things. People are like, I know that, right? This is also, I think, part of the virtue of Hyperion and the whole nature of metafiction and illusion in the first place is it's all built on what we used to call in literature the great conversation, right? And so even setting aside the fact that I like believe this stuff, right? You know, it means something to readers in a way that I think is persuasive, right? Like in the sense meaning like narratively convincing, right? And like maybe it's persuasive in other ways. I don't know, but I wanted to do that because it is the story, right? And it is the deepest story, right? And the most meaningful to even people who don't really pay that much attention to it. I hope this is making sense. And at the same time,
I think it does, because a lot of authors today, a lot of very popular and successful authors are Mormon, and so in some ways, if you know what a Mormon author is steeped in, you can see how in some of the work that is coming out that's extremely popular, you see that there's a retelling of the story of Mormonism. And so in your story, we're seeing some of a retelling of the journey of Christ, but obviously it's a new story, so it's the same but different. We've got some cool aspects to it. One other thing I wanted to ask you about was Valka as a character. She's you know, seen as this witch. Is she kind of this Mary Magdalene kind of character that we would get from Gnostic teaching, where it's like this is kind of Christ's wife in some sense, but never really accepted by the church in that way? That I mean, that's certainly a Gnostic read of like who Mary Magdalene is, and I kind of was getting a little bit of a sense of that as I was thinking.
Yeah,
no, I didn't get that one right.
Yeah, no, that's certainly not my intention because I dislike Gnostics. So I wouldn't verge on that. But the thing here too, right? It's very important is Hadrian isn't Christ. You know, his story sort of imitates and you know, recurs some motifs, but you know, again, as a Catholic, right, like that's sort of like the job, actually, right? Like, you know, we talk about the imitation of Christ, and if you look at the saints, right, and this is most clear, I think, in martyrs, right, because they also died, right? The story sort of in the George Lucas sense rhymes, right? You know, and so I tried to, this is one of the things I tried to puzzle out because, you know, my mother's side of the family is Protestant, and my wife's family is Protestant. So I tried to like explain the saints and things, like what do we need them for, right? And you know, there are like a lot of answers to that. It's, you know, hard to provide a single one. But like one part of it is to like give other examples, because actually if you like see the crucifixion over and over and over all the time, you can actually forget how important it is, because you just see it over and over, and it's just, it becomes furniture. You know, every classroom I was in until high school had a crucifix at the front of it, and it's just like, yeah, it's right next to the clock, you know. And if you don't stop and really appreciate it, right, you can stop seeing it completely. And if you then, you know, pause and you see, you see Saint Lucy with her eyes on a tray or something, you're like, wait a minute, hold on, what? Why are those eyeballs out, right? And then you have to remember that these are, you know, real people whose sort of example of heroic self-sacrifice, right? And conviction is worth aspiring to, and so they provide sort of parallel, not quite parallel, right? Because obviously they're not equivalent or equal or anything, but they provide additional examples of that central sort of ethic, right? And that is valuable. And so Hadrian is more like a saint than he is like Christ. I'm not saying, again, it's science fiction. It's not supposed to be literally, right? But because of that, Valka, I think, sort of doesn't fit into the sort of Christ heuristic precisely at all, because Hadrian is at least de facto married, right? Like, he's not celibate. She's a different character. The witch thing, right, is largely to do with imperial culture and Hadrian's sort of desire to always keep one foot out of it, right? He's always sort of a liminal figure. Heroes often are, right? Mythologically, right? You know, you think of think about Arthur, right? And Arthur's bastardy and his or Merlin's like Cambian nature in some of the stories, right? He's half a demon. You know, things like that, right? You know, or, you know, more tritely, like Aquaman is half Atlantean, right? Like, you know, you've got a lot of these sort of liminal heroic figures, and Hadrian's sort of outward reachingness is one of the things that keeps him on the fringes of his society. And Valka is a very real and present and vocal symbol of that sort of thresholdy nature in both of their characters.
When Grant introduced me to your books, and when he did, I read the first one, and I said, Augustine of Hippo. Was that, and I say that in part because sort of, you know, like the opening, like Augustine of Hippo was smuggled out of his house by his mother when he was young, but I think about the tension, you know, the introduction of some of the ideas that he brought, which in a way led to Protestantism. Is that somebody who you think about whenever you're thinking about the saints, or the role, the relationship between religion and the Romans?
I do think about Augustine pretty frequently, mostly because he's very important to my wife. Augustine is her confirmation name, and so there's sort of a more personal connection there. I'm quite sure he's more in the background of my thinking about the books. He appears by name a couple of times, just Hadrian referencing classical writers. And of course, to Hadrian, you know, it's just another classical writer, right? You know, Hadrian's familiar with Christianity broadly, but like he doesn't really consider it that much because it's so, you know, but for Edward, it's so distant from his conceptions
we get the Museum Catholic, so it's just kind of like we have the Museum Fremen in Dune, we have the Museum Catholic. So
it's a little bit of a nod to God Emperor is my favorite Dune novel.
Yes, it is the best Dune novel.
It's sublime. It's so great. It's like completely bananas, and it can't be anything other than the fourth book in a series. But
I completely agree. The God Emperor of Dune is the best book in the Dune series. It's the one that I always go back to, and then I always go forward from there. It's like I really love 4 and on. It's like my favorite part of the Dune series.
Yeah, I do not like 5 and 6, if I'm being honest. I love Miles Teague.
See, that's what I was going to say. Miles Teague is fantastic.
He's like basically top 5 in the whole series. He's great. But But like, boy, man, the honored mantras are tough. Like, I just can't take them seriously. It's very hard for me to read those last two books and not just be like, Frank, you need to put it away, man. Calm down. We get it. You're old now. You're getting a little weird. Those last two books are a challenge. And of course they suffer. There's no Dune 7, really, right? All due respect to Kevin, but I would have liked to see Frank's ending. And so I have a hard time with 5 and 6. I just don't know what to do with them because they're just not really conclusive. But I love,
going with Dune for just a second, because I see one other parallel, or at least something that resonated. And I'm not trying to say in any way that like this is retelling of Dune, but there's something that kind of reminds me of it. So Paul has his prescience, he has this ability to see into the future and pick the golden path. And Hadrian's got kind of a, I don't know, like an analogous kind of thing, but his power isn't necessarily to the future, but it's horizontal. So if there was a verticality to Paul's, he kind of looks forward. Hadrian can look sideways, and in some ways he can do things. He has this very mystical power that is somewhat hampered in a lot of ways because he has to not be distracted. He has to be able to summon his focus, and then he can pluck from the reality that he wants, and even plucks matter from it, which is pretty wild. Did you give yourself a strong limit to what Hadrian can do when he's tapping into this, or did you allow yourself the freedom to say, well, I'm going to allow him to do what the story needs him to do? Because some authors say you should have a strong magical system that has bounds and you should never violate it. I'm just kind of curious what you think and how you allowed Hadrian to express his power.
Yeah, so I'm laughing because I'm on the record frequently as detesting magic systems. I really, really don't like them. Magic in modern fantasy has become another branch of physics, and like all of the concerns fantasy writers have about magic are Newtonian. It's like a question of like how much energy do I need to cast the spell, right? Which is really useful if you're designing a video game, if you're playing D&D, if you're writing literature. I don't get it. I like the supernatural should.
Well, yours is a very quantum sort of magic. Very much.
Yeah. Well, it does have a scientific sort of explanation, because I'm writing ultimately science fiction, and I needed to sort of put on that language, but also because I do think I have this sense, right, that and I'm not the only one, but that like so I have this belief that like we will never actually get the grand unifying field theory in physics. I don't think our brains are big enough. I think that we are ultimately reaching for something that we can't grasp, and I do as a religious person, I think we're not meant to. I do think obviously there are beings that can and have and do frequently, and so I have this idea in writing science fiction, right? It's like, well, what would it look like to sort of stretch that human capacity, right? What if you could perceive these higher dimensions? What would that look like? And what could you do with that information and with that perception, right? Our ability to move 3-dimensionally would spook a Flatlander, right? So what would that look like if we go a little bit higher?
I love this. This is exactly where I thought you might go with this. It's like you have this 4th dimensional kind of concept. And so, as somebody who read Flatland and Abbott, like it just felt right, like how he was sort of tapping into this higher dimensional, 4th dimensional, like you can peer around corners, you can see everything all at once, and sort of just like, that's the one I want. And, so famously that he uses this to just kill one of the Cielcin princes just from afar. It's like, this is what's possible with this when you really tap into it.
Yeah, I mean, you see this with like quantum computing, right? You can have a sort of a qubit test combination blocks simultaneously, right? And just pick the right one. At least that's the theory, right? I don't know if the people have managed to actually build that yet, because you know what science articles are like on the internet. You hear all these great breakthroughs that like never seem to go anywhere. It's like, have they done it? I don't know. Have we cured cancer? I don't know. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy, right? But one does wonder, like, who's writing these articles, like what's happening, right? But there are a lot of interesting ideas out there, and so these things helped inspire a lot of that stuff. But if I were writing outright fantasy, I have this sense that magic needs to sort of function analogically. It needs to operate on a level of meaning in the story, as opposed to on the on the level of world building. I don't like all the supernatural stuff in modern fantasy. It feels perfectly natural, actually, to the world in question. And really, I remember I was talking to I was on another panel, I think it was, or maybe I was talking to someone who was pitching a book, and I was saying I don't like magic systems, and he said something like, well, then how do you have the big twist in your fantasy novel where the main character figures out something about the magic system and uses it to win? And I'm like, that's not how you end a fantasy novel. Get out of here. Like, it's you can maybe do that, but like, that doesn't have to be what it's about. What?
What do you see as like the epiphany? What's the alternative epiphany?
Well, we haven't. Wait a minute. We haven't got it yet. You're going to spoil book 7. This is
that might be the right answer, right? But like,
you gotta wait. You gotta read book 7.
Yeah, but there are other dimensions in literature. You don't need to you don't need to solve the plot on. I mean, Lord of the Rings isn't resolved by some quirk of the magic system, for example, right? It is resolved by seeming cosmic happenstance, right? And the virtues and vices of the characters playing out in such a way that what happens happens. And I find that incredibly satisfying, for example, right? Rather than just having the character crack the code and realize that actually I could just do the magical equivalent of give the aliens a computer virus.
Dorothy, you were always wearing the magic shoes. You could always go home.
Yeah, or whatever, right? Like, and I'm not saying this is always bad. You mentioned Rothfuss at the beginning, right? I really do love the bit in Name of the Wind where he uses the barrel of water and the dragon's scale to quench all of the fire in the village by immersing the thing in the barrel, right? And the barrel boils off, right? But like, it does put out all the fires. It's very cool. You understand exactly why that worked. It is very satisfying. But ultimately, the lesson that readers come away from that happening is, I would be a very good wizard in that world, which is useless because that world isn't real and that magic doesn't work, right? The sort of meaning you need to impart on your audience as an artist, right, is something that should be useful to them, right? Spiritually, psychologically, personally, right? It can't just be cool, right? Cool is important. That's how you get people in the door, but like, it doesn't make people stay, right? There's there's another David Lynch line where he's talking about closure. And how closure is like a drug, right? And there's a sense that if all you're giving your readers is some sort of satisfying world building, that they will leave your book completely satisfied. And I think you need to do more than that. I hope I've written books that people will reread 10 and 20 times. Or maybe 3. That would be good. But I think the goal is to make a book that still has something to say on the 30th read. Hopefully I've done that. And if I haven't, maybe the 29th. So, we'll see.
And you mentioned Le Guin earlier, Ursula Le Guin.
Mm-hmm.
Are you a fan of hers? And if so, what do you take from Ursula?
I try not to use the word fan, period, but I admire her very much. I really enjoy, particularly the first couple Earthsea books. I like a lot of her short stories. As far as like a single takeaway, I don't know, right? I don't have anything sort of deep or meaningful to hit you with here. She is a very wonderful writer, sorry, this is a very lame answer. I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
I just asked because I thought she always seemed a little bit adverse to magic too, like a very, sort of simple, austere invocation.
I think the less that you use magic in fantasy, the more impactful it is. At the same time, right, you shouldn't go so low in your fantasy that your world is indistinguishable from a bad parody of medieval England. I love medieval England, right? But like, if all you've got is, I'm back up. I was really struck in my last read through of Lord of the Rings by the sort of spirit of every place the hobbits go to, especially early in the Fellowship, right? It's not just that the old forest is like a spooky forest, right? You know, the trees want stuff, right? The whole place has an attitude problem, right? And then they go to the Barrow Downs, and like the hills are actually haunted, right? Like it's not safe to be in them, right? And they have a character that like can sort of be reasoned with, right? And that's part of what I love Tom Bombadil. I think it's in Tom Bombadil that we have this like sort of as clearly as possible. He is like the sort of principality of those woods, right? He's like the spirit of that forest, and he has absolute power there, right? And it's been sort of placed in him, and he has the ability to reason with, you know, the trees and the land, and he like can tell the rain to leave him alone and stuff like that. And because of that, the texture of those places is so rich and so convoluted in a way that most fantasy settings aren't, right? And I think that austerity you sense in Le Guin has a character of its own as well, right? Because she does, and Guy K is like this too. When magic happens in a Guy K novel, it's so angular and so supernatural because it's so unusual. But I also think too that her magic really does function on the level of meaning and analogy, and you see this like the names in Earthsea having the ability to really change people, right? And that's like really deep, and it doesn't function mechanistically. There's a reason to it that you can understand. I'm not against magic making sense, right? Or Hadrian's powers for that matter, but I'm against the way in which they make sense simply being a question of energy input, right? And the magic in Earthsea is about meaning, right? It's about the story, it's about the characters, it's about their souls, right? And who they are, in a way that magic in most contemporary fantasy is about mana points.
This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, Christopher. I think you have achieved a series that people want to read multiple times. I've gone through it multiple times. I absolutely found it to be fantastic. You know, when I first read it and then introduced it to others and wanted to experience it with them. So I definitely feel it's got something on the reread. So in my opinion, you've done it, and I'm looking forward to seeing the ending that you envisioned and how this is going to play out. So book 7, here we go. It's announced that you finished it today. We've got Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 4 released today. So if you're ready to have your final fill of Sun Eater, this is the year. You know, here we are, 2025, and it's going to come to its grand conclusion. And I'm very much looking forward to November.
Yeah, gosh. Well, thank you. I hope you like it. You know, it's still early. Some anxiety about how people will, you know, feel, but you know, everyone who's read it likes it, so that's reassuring. But it is early days, so we'll see what you think.
All right, great. Any last thoughts, Lucas? Want to wrap it up, or anything that you wanted to get to that we haven't quite yet had a chance to say?
No, really enjoyed it. Thank you, Christopher, for coming on, and I also look forward to finishing this out. So, and whatever you have in store after that.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on, guys.
All right, and we'll see you next time on FoMO.